System riding to the core. Yeah. Reppin' inner city left.
This is the Inner City Left broadcast. Today is Thursday, April 3rd. I am Amin TMK alongside Emoji Lil Tanky Sumler and Mike from TurnLeftist. Mike, thank you so much for being on the show. How are you doing today, bro?
Good as always. Thank you again for having me. Appreciate it.
Our pleasure. Tanky, I asked the same question to you. How are you doing on this fine Thursday?
Man, I'm making it do what it do.
That's great news. I'm always so thankful to have both of you. So let's just jump into it. I've been wanting to talk about this for a while. And as you can tell by the title, that is America's decline culturally. And that is, I think, been kind of a long time coming. I know Tanky talks about this, like in a lot of ways, the Soviet Union was, kind of taken down by Nike and McDonald's hamburgers. And in a lot of ways, culture wars are a huge part of, geopolitical positioning and, all the things that come with winning over hearts and minds, which is so important to propaganda, so important to, what we do, as activists and, so on and so forth. So I wanted to talk about that. I think this has sort of all been on our mind, so I'm going to just open it up first on this. We saw one of the most famous there's one of the most famous streamers in the world, iSpeed. I don't watch the whole thing. I'm not involved with it, but I have heard of dude, and I know that a lot of people watch it. But he's kind of a streamer. He does a lot of cool things. He's kind of a cool guy. Races people, participates in a bunch of challenges. 30 million followers on Instagram. But either way, he went on a tour of China, and from what I heard, I can't confirm it, but the scuttlebutt was it was sort of a way to kind of show how backwards China was and poor, and how poverty is stricken it is, and maybe getting people trying to scam you or something like that. That was sort of the idea behind it. And when he went there, just like many leaders, it's not just speed. I mean, you have literally leaders of countries, ambassadors, diplomats, foreign ministers going to China and telling you, I don't see a single homeless person on the street. Their 12th best city looks like it's in 2070, or I should say we look like we're in 1984. I'll just leave it at that. But regardless of, thank you so much. I thought that was a big cultural shift. A lot of people are seeing sort of the BYDs, these huge skyscrapers. And wondering why again is China? What are they doing wrong? And I just I wanted to bring that up. Obviously, we that doesn't have necessarily a change in policy, and obviously the United States is still going to be heavily involved in trying to destabilize China through Taiwan or any of its other of its proxies. But I wanted to start with you, Mike, and then Tanky, you can jump right in. Is sort of how China has not only, we know obviously because we study this, we're analysts, we're participants in the movement, but now you're starting to see sort of the general culture, the general American culture start to see China as an innovator, a leader, where things are a lot better. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. And if you had seen the speed thing and all that stuff, Mike, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, like I was saying before we started recording, it just feels so good to have so much winning. Like, how much of this winning can we take? Like, for us who have been saying this for so long, that not only is China just a normal country with normal people, it's not some kind of evil fascist dystopia like your leaders and propagandists have been making you believe. It's just like we've been saying, people who unironically believe what the New York Times tells you about other countries, you are more propagandized than what you think North Koreans are. And I feel sad for them, but I guess that we're finally just getting proven right, and it feels so good. It just feels good to have all of these things vindicate us in just what were our normal, very not racist beliefs, just not being xenophobic. So it's great to see. And even I Show Speed, it's do you guys think it's a little funny and curious that the guy who brings Chinese culture to Americans and shows them that it's actually really cool is not some kind of famous diplomat or politician. It's a YouTube streamer. I feel like that says a lot right there, about who is our representative. It's a guy who's popular on YouTube. He has millions of followers. It might as well have been Mr. Beast, but it couldn't have been because I feel like he's a CIA op, right?
Yeah, we never can tell exactly who is and who isn't an
It
op
just
and
feels
why
like
things
it.
happen, but it absolutely, well, I think with Mr. Beast's case, it definitely is. But I was saying this too. I don't know if you remember this, Mike. I'm gonna give it right back to you. If you remember when Dennis Rodman went to North Korea, like
Oh,
as a
right,
part of
yeah.
their like ambassador, like a basketball ambassador or whatever, and he was like granted like unheard of access into North Korea. And I think of these like the cultural like holding out your hand or like holding out a hug or something like that culturally, or olive branch, obviously, is sort of the regular term. But, I think that was an interesting moment. And maybe that's sort of what's happening now.
Yeah, apparently. So I was looking at it on Google a little bit before we got on here, and apparently the Chinese embassy in the U.S. praised Speed's efforts to bridge cultural gaps and provide an unfiltered glimpse into China. And yeah, I mean, I feel like that's what we were talking about the last time we spoke, was about Red Note, giving people an unfiltered glimpse into what China is actually like, what the people there are actually doing. And then even being able to see North Korea, because you could see people who were like traveling from China to North Korea for work, and they would just take videos of the town. It was just like a normal place with people just walking around, doing normal things, going to work, living their lives. But again, I just wonder how much of people are going to like sink back into their old ways. Like you can see the nature of American propaganda about a place like China. It lives in like the ephemeral. So like the people will watch a video like I Show Speed doing fun things, like having a good time in like a normal culture, and then say, well, what are we not seeing? What are they hiding behind these scenes? Like what are they actually doing to a bunch of Muslims that they also don't care about, that they're like oppressing here in the US for protesting a genocide? That's like what they always do. It's like the go-to, like, what are we not seeing? Like this is the facade, like what's actually going on. So, which is predictable.
Tanky, any thoughts on that? I know we talk a lot about BYDs, we talk a lot about capacity, all that good stuff. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. So one thing I would say is like, as to our point about Mr. Beast, in the era of redaction, right, which I think is anathema to a democracy, like there should be, even if a government has a position that there are certain things that we have to do that we can't allow the population to know right now, there should always be, and theoretically there is, a statute of limitations on how long they can hide a thing, right? And when that thing comes out, it doesn't mean anything if it's all fucking redacted. I mean that to say, a lot of people work for the Department of State that are not necessarily cleared. Like that whole thing with Rodman, it always felt weird to me. Like I couldn't go to North Korea if I wanted to right now and develop a relationship with Kim Jong-un, right? So like, the fact that he was able to do that, I would be deeply shocked if he was not on some level working and serving the Department of State on some capacity, right? And we'll probably never know. But it does say something that we use these cultural ambassadors as unofficial spokespeople. But this is something that goes on quite a lot. Most Americans have a really, I would say, distorted view of what our relationship officially is with China, because you listen to the propaganda of what the United States says without looking at what the actual policy is, right? The propaganda of the United States says Taiwan is a country and they have the right to defend themselves. The policy says there is only one China in Taiwan. You know what I'm saying? But the propaganda is they're our great enemy. The reality is, people like Bill Gates goes and has birthdays with Xi Jinping. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, like for all of the anti-China, like all of the time, Kissinger was spending most of his moonlight years in China, right? Like even guys like Elon Musk, most of your production chain is in China, right? So like, it's actually much harder to go to Russia right now than it is to go to China or to do business with Russia than it is to do business with China right now. Theoretically, all you got to do is pay the fucking taxes and you can go to China. You could become a resident. It's not a competitive thing with having a United States citizenship, right? But that's not the way you would think. The way the government's propaganda is, it's like we're in a de facto state of war with China. And you have to ask yourself, why is it that we've been conditioned to believe that we have actually quite hostile relationship with them when the reality is people go there and they're completely disavowed, right, of like their preconceived notions of what China is. I hear people talk about, they still talk like this mind state of when full spectrum domination was a thing, if it ever was, the United States, we spend more than the next 10 countries combined when it comes to military. And it's like, okay, so first off, that's a scale. And even that is weird when you look at the rate of what the scale of economies look like, right? And then what are the services that one gets from such a thing, right? Like if that budget in America is all buying F-35s that are $18 trillion a piece, and you only get 5, the budget is still $18 trillion a piece times 5, right? Whereas in Russia,
look at healthcare. Healthcare,
right?
America spends an incredible amount of healthcare, and it sucks.
Right. Meanwhile, Russia's buying practical things like 155 millimeter, mortar shells and artillery, things that are still utilized.
Warehouses for drones, FPV drones.
You know what I'm saying? So like you're spending less, but it does not mean that your capacity is less, right? And most of the people realize that. The person that just was in the Senate for the hearings to become the Joint Chief of Staffs admitted under oath that the United States military capacity as it stands as of yet is not a match for China in the South China Seas. But the average American thinks we could press a button and make China disappear. Like if we really wanted to, we could press a button and make Russia disappear. That's how propagandized we are, to your point, in ways that are not in keeping with reality.
Yeah.
Great point. Great conversation. I just want to keep it with you for a second too, Tanky. I mean, again, we always are sending each other YouTube videos or reels on these BYD cars. I know just hoping we talked about the Russian Aris and all that other stuff, but these BYD cars, you wouldn't think that BYD is the number one car seller in the world because they're not here in the United States, but they are. They're less expensive. They have more things. Can you speak to that a little bit? And then, Mike, I'll tag you in after that.
I mean, they're less expensive and they're more expensive, right? They're whatever budget you got. You got $300,000 to spend on a car, they got one for you. And, to your point, that's what iShowSpeed was looking at. Like, he couldn't even believe, like, $300,000 isn't even going to get you a McLaren in the West, right? Meanwhile, he's got a dancing transformer car in China, doing the Trump dance with him, like making it drop, and that's what I'm saying. People think that, and again, this goes back to what J.D. Vance was saying, these nations were supposed to be supply chain nations where you just build all of our trinkets and you never develop a native organic manufacturing base that can, in fact, surpass the capacity of the Americans that you're doing the work for. They never expected these guys to be able to build the house. They were just supposed to lay foundations, do labor work, And that's what you're seeing.
Mill the wood or something like that. That's
right.
all you need. Yep, supply chain.
Right. America is the great propagandization of open markets. That's what we believe in. Meanwhile, the president just declared Victory Day or whatever because he's taxing the world on
he crashed the stock market.
You know what I'm saying? Right. But he's a business president, right? People think that American and Western products are the best when the fact is the American markets are so incredibly protectionist, you never even get to see the better things that exist if they're made from other countries. You were never meant to find TikTok. You know what I'm saying? It just became this huge success. The average American has no idea that Huawei makes the best phones in the world that can fold down into 3 parts and, you know what I'm saying, that can totally integrate with every smart device in your house. You can set your toaster to make the whatever the hell, on your way home from your job, link through your BYD car through voice control. Like,
your toaster is spying on you if you bought it from China.
You know what I'm saying? The fact is, China's closer to fucking Wakanda, right? Like when you wouldn't believe, that's what happened with iShowSpeed. You're going there and you're thinking it's going to be some Bruce Lee movie where you're off in some old 3,000-year-old Chinese village. which they exist too, by the way, right?
Fishing
but they
village.
have high-speed rail that connects them to Chengdu, you know? So, like, yeah, it's exactly what you think. And it's way beyond anything you've even considered. And the fact that it's not illegal for any American to even go and find these things out. I think what's interesting is people have known this is coming for a long time. People forget that Snowden, when he left America with that bag of secrets, he didn't go to Russia. He went to China first. Like, I think y'all need to know about some things.
Yeah, I forgot that. I didn't know that.
They're working on, and China copied the disk and kicked his ass out. Like, we're not about to get into that right now. We'll take
Wow.
that data that you have. Have you thought about contacting the Moscow, directorships, right? So he ends up in Moscow, but he wanted to go to China first because he understood as an outsource, what do you call it? When you're outsourcing for the alphabet organizations, he knew what everybody else knew in those industries. China was preeminent. China was rising, and he wanted to hedge his bets with who he thought was going to be the next great power. China being China, they're like, man, you fucking messy. Thank you for the knowledge. Get the fuck. We move on our own time, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, Mike.
You know, the contrast of like what is served to you about other countries versus what's actually going on there. Like, did you guys, before the Red Note app became popular, did you ever see any content from global South countries like India or China or anywhere served to you on TikTok or Reels and find that it was always something that looked like what I guess you would imagine stereotypically to be a third world country, but basically just poverty. And it was only like later on, I think after the Red Note became popular, that I found out that there is a subculture of like fetishizing the 90s in China where they like kind of miss that. Like there's some nostalgia around the 90s poverty culture where people live this like rural lifestyle. In particular, there's a lot of channels where these old guys run like these candy shops and these kids come in and they give like pocket change and they get these little candy things in there. It's like for adults that are like reminiscing about having that kind of stuff and like whatever of those things still exist. But then the reality, like when you see it on Red Note or like when I Show Speed goes there, you see it's like a modern culture. But that's of course not what people picture. And I think you guys have probably also seen when JD Vance gave that speech and he was talking about, he just gave away the whole game about the American trade relationship with other countries. And he said, you know, it wasn't supposed to be this way. Like it was always the case that they built our stuff. We showed them how to do it. They were really good at manufacturing and then they would do it very cheaply, but they wouldn't steal our intellectual property. They wouldn't actually learn the complicated processes. Like we basically just could keep them under our thumb. And it wasn't even saying it that crassly, but like pretty close. It was like pretty racist in its tone. And it became sensational for that reason because he was just giving the whole game away. And that's been the frustration with the West, with China for a long time. Like the way that they keep saying like, oh, look, they'll just copy an entire Apple store and it's not licensed or trademarked in any way. And they just do it because they want to enforce like the intellectual property laws from the West. I'm like, yeah, they're beating you at your own game. Like they realize that shit's not important. And their little cartel ship that you call a government doesn't have any power there. And you're mad about it. Like that's basically what it is. Like you're just pissed that your little rules that keep you in power and keep your wealth flowing in don't work in this other culture that actually stole everything out from under you because you thought you could keep them subjugated. And so it's just great to see. I really enjoy it. But I know we had like started to talk about, like you invited me on a couple of days ago to talk about American cultural loss of hegemony, but like now we're seeing the economic loss of dominance. Like it's so great because like I know you'd mentioned like when you had DM'd me about Nija breaking like box office records, and I looked that up too. It said apparently Boonie Bears Time Twist was the previous like box office record for China, and it's like a smash hit. So let's see, what did they say? It's gross over $2 billion and becoming the highest grossing animated film and sixth highest grossing film ever at press time. So that's Nija too. So like breaking into the last like realm of dominance that the US really has as far as like cultural hegemony, like the movie industry. It's like that's what the US has been relying on to spread its message and its soft power all over the world with its TV and movie industry. And it's like if China were to somehow subvert the Wall Street industry, like just the American financial industry as well, that would be it. Like it's literally just over. And I've seen people who theorize that Bitcoin was created by the Chinese government to do exactly that. And then having Trump and Elon like incorporate crypto into the government the way that they have would just be like the icing on the cake. Like it's the perfect thing to have that actually happen in practice, to like bring all those cryptos into the government, incorporate them in such an official way, and then find out too little too late that China actually has control over the crypto market because they control the mining enough, or they control something about it that you did not anticipate. Like they actually had created Bitcoin, and Satoshi Nakamoto was actually the Chinese deep state all along, and they have some kind of backdoors into the Bitcoin. Like that would be my dream scenario. Like I'm hoping we find that out in the next few months or so. But it's all great because none of that even has to be a conspiracy. It just is the logical conclusion of having a culture like the US that is built on privatization, hollowing things out, financialization, like removing the actual productive force of anything and then replacing it with hollow performance and just financialization that makes a lot of people very wealthy, but then impoverishes the people who actually do create things. And that can only go on for so long. But the logical conclusion of that is to have a game show, now car salesman, deals guy who through his deals bankrupts your entire economy and crashes your whole stock market. Like it's fantastic. It's so beautiful to watch.
Yeah, and if I could piggyback off of that, again, it shows the difference between governments that work with each other for long periods of time, right? And can come up with cohesive plans where you have bureaucracies that are not meant to have zero-sum game, right? Where the point of the bureaucracy is never to get anything done, right? The whole point is to keep a status quo or, a step to the right. You compare and contrast, Cory Booker, singing and dancing for 25 hours, not even actually doing a boycott or, you know what I'm saying? Like you're not even filibustering. You just
didn't mention Gaza.
You know what I'm saying? Wearing your Israeli pin. Meanwhile, like China's already with their government come up with an effective, cohesive policy rebuttal to Trump's tariffs, right? Like when you're talking about the scale of government and how they move with that type of efficiency, it shows you really the type of adversary the United States is choosing to keep for itself. Whereas the United States is targeting essentially consumer goods with China, China's tariffs are now targeting areas, like entire industrial areas of the United States. For example, the single largest purchaser of American coal, right? And please understand, whereas petroleum is a commodities market where lots of people have lots of say and can disrupt that pie, the United States is a very big player. Fuck what you heard. Russia's a huge player. Iran, Venezuela, huge players. The Saudis, right? When it comes to coal, there's only one game in town, and it's America. And by far and away, their largest client was China, right? So they put all of these silly sanctions on consumer goods coming into America from China. China hits them back with tariffs on American coal because, again, that's the curse of having a preeminent number one client, which is China. Right. But China's already diversifying its energy needs. Energy is something where you get it and you flex it as you need it. And so now America, which has become overly reliant on Chinese buying this coal, right? China gets to step away from the coal. They get to also move closer to their anti-pollution goals, right? And meet their Paris Agreement, right? Obligations while moving away, moving closer to a native green energy movement that they're radicalizing with their lithium. I mean, it's everything steps into the next step and it's logical. It's not throwing chaos at your enemies and making them duck. Some of them are water balloons with water, but really we don't know what's in the water balloon, right? China has a very cohesive policy about this is exactly what I'm going to do to you. And it's not chaos. It's thought out and it's planned, and the government moves with efficiency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you muted, I mean.
Thanks for your help, Mike. Great points, everyone. I wanted to, just mention sort of, America always does these things that hurt themselves. You know, we mentioned it being like the Cobra effect, where they try to fix something and it actually goes worse for them. Or, you know, you have a situation where, I mean, we watch a lot of these, you know, former CIA agents, you know, or former Department of Defense, as if you could be something that's former in that regard.
It totally seems like the kind of company you just quit. You know, I don't work with you guys anymore.
You know, and something that they always talk about is how these agencies are really just run by presidential policy at this point. They don't really operate in the ways, like, they don't really have that much like independence. They are completely sort of, you know, attached to whatever the political, you know, desire is for that particular party. And often that goes against what's possible. I mean, the Americans have been doing things that are just not possible for quite some time. Global hegemony is not a possibility. So because of that, things are slipping through your fingers at all times. And also, if you look at, you mentioned, Tanky, a great, you know, or Mike, I can't remember what, you know, which one, but you guys mentioned the stock market. In China, the stock market is not a big deal. And they regulate it very, very, very particularly. And as you know, they, you know, they put a billionaire who, you know, had created, you know, mass devastation, you know, to sentence them to death, you know, and China takes those things very seriously because corruption is bad. I don't know if we need to say this. We live in the most corrupt country that there is possible. And I think, Mike, you were also mentioning this, like, we talk about this all the time. If you live in America, worry about yourself. You don't need to be worrying about what's going on in China unless you see high-speed rail, or unless you see no homelessness or poverty reduction to a level of when there is someone that is impoverished, people eat for free. When there is someone impoverished, the community builds up funds so that person can have. Like, you know, again, I just want to say, maybe you should juxtapose your country to another country. If you live in America, juxtapose it. I you know, put something out on Inner City Left at Instagram, you know, at Inner City Left, I should say, you know, where I'm like, China's a better country than America. Can we just acknowledge this is true? Like, can we just start there, please? You know, like, I don't think that that's a crazy statement. Not saying that China's infallible or does not have things that I would change. I think go ahead, Teggy.
What I would challenge any liberal to do is any critique you have for China, but really any nation in the world, any critique you have for any nation, apply that same critique towards the United States and see if you're like, you know, see if you're impressed with the solution, right? Oh, China's human rights violations. Okay, the United States actually has a larger percentage of its population in prison than any other country in the world. Like an American prison where literally anything can happen to you. Like, you can go to jail for, I don't know, kiting a check, right? And be subjected to all of the horrors that one might be subjected to in American interrogation, a place where no one goes for rehabilitation, where it's almost impossible to become a better person coming out than you came in. So there's no chance that taking these people away and subjecting them to this is making them better people, right? Right?
50
oh my God.
Correctional facilities don't correct shit.
Right. Oh, my God. Look at the way that LGBT are treated in Russia. Okay. In America, right? You can't even necessarily get your gender certified by the government, right? So, like, any critique you can throw for any of these nations, there's none of these problems that we've solved in America. Children go hungry in America. You know, I mean, that was the great lie of the 80s, you know, when I'm Gen X growing up, you know, in Reagan's America. There's hungry kids in Africa. There are hungry kids in motherfucking Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, great point. I wanted to bring, I'm going to pivot a little bit. We can talk about China all day. I know that. But we are not that far away, just a few months, I think 3 months away from inauguration. And we're still sort of, I don't know, I guess people are not feeling the backlash of the election. It feels like it never happened, actually. But I do think, I mean, I don't think, I know that Kamala Harris's lost the Harris Waltz ticket. One of the big reasons they didn't win, and there are many, is there's a G-Stide still happening and continuing in Gaza right now, not to mention escalations in West Bank, escalations in Lebanon, HTS in Syria and the taking of the furthering of strategic positions by Israel, the Yemenis, the Houthis, Ansarallah, these are major issues. I mean, major destabilizing factors in the Middle East. And the fact of the matter is, not just the Middle East, not just Arabs, not just Muslims, basically the entire global South, and even in countries that are traditionally are usually in alliance or in lockstep, like the United States is with Israel. Their populations often are pushing back, and I think again the social toll. Obviously, there is an incredible human toll, and I'm not trying to diminish that. I'm just saying, and also Palestine is like 30 different issues all in one. But I do believe, and I'll get your thoughts, Mike. I'll start with you. Sort of how America is hurt culturally by and the Democratic Party too, because the Democratic Party is at this point has presided longer over that particular G side. But sort of how has that impacted the rest of the world's opinion of the United States? Mike, I'll start with you, and then I'll go to you, Tanky.
I think the only overarching character of it is that I just feel like Americans still don't understand their position. And I feel like it's just a matter of positionality to me. It's like, and I can only compare the US to Nazi Germany because it's like the easiest comparison to make. But it's like when your country starts committing genocides and even your Democratic Party is endorsing that, it's like that changes your position in the world, and it changes the position of your so-called revolutionary leftist orgs. And I've been saying for a long time that like if we are left with orgs that only do mutual aid and protests and then hope that that builds into some kind of real revolutionary movement later on, which it has proven not to do since our last vanguard party, the Black Panthers, was like destroyed. We've had about, what's that, the 70s or 60s? So we've had like 60, 70 years of proof that we have to either build something that replaces that, or we're kind of just joking around and we're kind of accepting the fascism that we're under. And that's where we're at. Like, I feel like our leftist movement has become the liberal movement, just as our liberal movement is now the fascist movement. And then the right wing, the conservatives, are out and out fascists. And so much of this, like, since I think 9/11, probably, the general American consciousness has realized, on one hand, that we are the bad guys. Like, it's been commonplace to talk about the military industrial complex and how it's bad to just invade Iraq, invade Afghanistan, invade sovereign countries, enforce our will. Like, the Middle East was always the easiest thing to bring up because it wasn't complicated. It wasn't white people. Whereas, like, you start bringing up Europe, Ukraine, like Georgia, Crimea, or anything like that, it gets a little more tough for Americans to see America's influence as bad in those areas. But they will tolerate it in the Middle East, and they'll say, well, we should just be out of there. Like, I don't want to spend that money on those people. That's like beneath us. We should not be doing that. So that made Americans comfortable with the idea of retracting the military in order to then get more benefits at home, things like healthcare. And of course, that didn't happen because that was a basic misunderstanding of how imperialism works, how America actually derives its super profits that it would use to pay for social programs and things like that. This is all just to say, like, China, like you're mentioning, is just a better culture. They show that, like, what you can do when you have a better system from the ground up. And when Americans then respond by bragging about things like their GDP, well, that just shows that, like, you have a different system that values the wealth of your wealthiest people. And that's why it measures your country's well-being in things like GDP, like how wealthy your wealthy people are, rather than the PPP, the purchasing power parity, like how much your citizens can actually buy with their dollars that they get from working. It just shows that there's a difference in the fundamental ideology, and Americans are still resting on that dynamic that they thought they could rest on for a lot longer, which was, okay, yeah, I realized since 2002 we are the bad guys, but what can I do? Oh, but okay, but we still should police the world for X or Y reason because we're still better than those other savages. We're still better than, God forbid, Russia or China. Like, as much as we hate that the U.S. is declining in its influence, we still don't want to see a stronger Russia. It's like, why not? Like, what's bad about China? These are countries that have proven that they are not as meddling, they're not as oppressive, they don't have the desires of imperialism that the U.S. openly has, let alone like has exercised. So all this like projection that people do to other countries to say that we have to contain them and prevent them from exercising their imperialism, it's just projection. And I think it's just, that's what Americans are dealing with. They thought that they could ride that out for a lot longer.
They think that they're going to do what we do
Yeah.
to them. They think they're going to do that to Americans.
And that's terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it just goes back, like you said, kind of to the mentality of Americans. At the end of the day, they're okay with fascism. The whole country is being moved towards the right. Yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off, Mike. Did you have anything?
No, that was it.
Tanky, I'm going to throw you in there if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So, in the context of Israel, it's important to always look at America, look at Israel not as a sovereign country, but as an American project. You are the ungloved fist of the American military project. You know what I'm saying? And it makes it easier to understand the things that happen when you look at it from that context. Most Americans lack the fundamental beginning starting point to make most of these conflicts make sense, right? Everything you've been taught about World War II, you kind of understand, but if you were to look at it more as emerging empires crashing, right? The English Empire crashed against Germany's empire. The French Empire crashed against Germany's empire. The German Empire crashed itself against the Russian Empire, right, as it stood, right? The Japanese, and this is also incredibly important, and Americans forget about this contribution. The Imperial Japanese Empire crashed itself against the American Empire and crashed itself against China. Okay, so when you look at it framed from that perspective, right, now it begins to make a little bit more sense. If you think about it as the German Empire then ate the British Empire, ate the French Empire. In that place, the British and the French call out to the American Empire for aid. So now the American Empire absorbs what's left of the British Empire and the French Empire, and then launch themselves against the German Empire and the Japanese Empire. The Chinese Empire is simply trying to subsist. It's trying to not be subsumed. It's the war with the Chinese Imperial Army and Mao's army, right, that weakens the Japanese army to the point whereas the Americans are able to come in and finish off the job. It's the Russian Empire grinding down the German Empire to the point whereas the Americans are able to finish the job. But the end of the job was always to have one empire win. So after you subsume the Japanese Empire and make it part of the American Empire, you subsume the British Empire, the French Empire, the German Empire. It's all yours now. You call it something else, the EU. Just like the United States, you're the European United States, right? But what remains are the empires that were not subsumed. The Russian Empire still exists, as it were, right? Even in its greatly diminished state, it's still a vast, it's the largest landmass in the world as far as a country goes. China is the third largest, with the second largest population. Not an empire, but still a sphere of influence worthy of understanding, right? And a market to control. The American perspective was the same as all of those others, right? When you look at the Japanese Empire, the German Empire, the British Empire, and the French Empire. Control everything. The Chinese and the Russians are not yet under control. And the game is great politic hegemony. Like, that's really what you need to understand World War II. Not like Nazis and ideology. All of that is important, but really it's just the smokescreen behind in the game of capitalism, which is gotta catch it all. It's the original Pokemon. And China is not captured. Russia is not captured. The hegemon can suffer no rivals, if only for its imagination of who it is. I'm the world's policeman. I can go anywhere. I determine who gets to have nuclear technology, who doesn't get to have nuclear technology. I'm the arbiter of everything good in the world, right? That's not true. If you have two countries that can be like, man, fuck what they say. We don't do what they say. That in and of itself becomes a threat. It's not that they want to interject themselves on the American empire. They simply don't want to be subsumed by it. And that in and of itself makes it a threat and targeted for deletion.
Exactly, yeah.
Well said. Yeah, I mean, I think we There was a on our last episode, Mike. I mentioned this, where there is sort of this idea. I don't think, of course, obviously leftists didn't have it and liberals didn't have it, but conservatives had it that Trump was going to be some sort of, you know, anti-war candidate or something. I don't know how people, obviously liberals convince themselves of ridiculous things. I assume conservatives can, convince themselves of ridiculous things. But we are now still currently killing civilians in Yemen. There was, I believe, a report. We haven't talked about it here, with the United States funding, terrorist groups in Eastern Africa. I believe it was Eritrea, but I'm not exactly sure. I have to double check on that. But it is sort of this thing that the United States is constantly meddling in your country, and one of the things that we like to talk about, and I know you post about it as well, is the Sahel states.
Mhm.
And Traore sort of as this, leader that, goes back to the days of Patrice Lumumba and Thomas Sankara and all those things. Something that he mentioned and something that he talked about at length a few times was having no problem with Russian businesses being there, or his respect for Russia and sort of their anti-imperialist history, as well as sort of the facts that's on the board, which is Russia is not involved within any imperialism in Africa and never has. These are things that, the Sahel states, and these are the things that I think many countries in Africa are looking at when they look at places like Nigeria, places like South Africa, places like Egypt with General President Sisi. It's so many places that the Americans have these tendrils that when you see someone like Traore, someone who's, backed by the people, someone who is, in the interest of their particular country, can say, oh, well, actually, Russians are cool. Actually, I think Putin is a pretty good leader. And, we see sort of these people that we should be applauding, right? That we should be saying, wow, look at this leadership and look at how this is, radically changing Burkina Faso or Mali or any of the Sahel states, or sort of the affiliation surrounding them, helping the people, like you said, the PPP, the purchase power parity. Because if people are unable to afford things, what's the point? I know that Burkina Faso just put out their own electric car, and that often is something that is a huge thing for many countries. So I just wanted to talk to you about that, because I know me and Tanky always talk about Russia and Putin and the Russia-Ukraine war, and obviously, because it's white people fighting white people, everyone's confused about which side is the right side. But anyway, just sort of taking that, especially like African countries, or just sort of in general, people are looking at Russia and Putin in a different light than obviously the United States. Even President Trump is looking at it in a different light, which is so different than what we saw during the Biden administration. If you could just speak to that.
I think a quick point is that it's actually pretty consistent with Trump's fan base for him to still be the anti-war president, simply by ending the white-on-white war in Ukraine and then continuing the other operations against brown people. Like, they're totally fine with that. That's all they actually wanted to end. And they also don't even really care, probably, if Russian and Ukrainian people fight, as long as they're not paying for it. Because that seems like that's going to be the development, right? Like, Europe is now going to start to at least pretend that they're going to pony up a bunch of weapons or money to continue this thing. I don't see that actually happening. I don't see that being like a realistic continuation of that war front, but whatever, they're at least talking about it for now. And again, that'll just be consistent with his fan base. They'll be totally fine with that happening. But speaking of Traore, like, I don't know. I think I feel like I do this every time I talk to you guys. Like, I don't like to do the great man theory, but he's just such a Chad. The guy's just such a hero. Just watching the way the guy operates. Like, one of the quotes I saw from him recently, they were like, someone said to him, don't you worry that you're going to become like a Lumumba or a Thomas Sankara? And he's like, I'm not scared. I don't care. I'm not scared to die fighting for my people. It's like, to see that level of badass in someone, like, you just love to see it. I also did a little bit of Googling, and I wanted to see like what the takes are online about like the Russian influence in Burkina Faso. One thing that was mentioned was the Russian House, and I didn't even know this was a thing. This is like a Russian organization. The Russian House, a non-governmental Russian cultural center, began operating Burkina Faso's capital. I'm not even going to try and butcher that name. Sorry, you guys. In January 2024, it offers Russian language courses and cultural exchange programs with about 120 people currently enrolled and 1,200 on the waiting list. The center's activities are part of Russia's broader strategy to strengthen ties with Burkina Faso and other African countries. This includes agreements to build a nuclear power plant and provide security assistance. And Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov visited Burkina Faso in June 2024 to further bilateral relations, emphasizing mutual respect and cooperation. And I also looked on Wikipedia under their modern relations section between Burkina Faso and Russia. They said, this was just a funny line to me. People who demonstrated in favor of the coup did so with Russian flags. This is when Burkina Faso underwent the military coup led by Ibrahim Traore. And they were accused by the government of Ghana of hiring Wagner mercenaries to fight the country's jihadist insurgency. How dare they? How dare you use Wagner Group to fight jihadists? And it just speaks to the hypocrisy of liberals who will say that they critically support, not that they know that term, say that they critically support groups like Azov or whatever militias that are open neo-Nazis in Ukraine because they have to fight those dirty Ruskies and those orcs or whatever. But then they don't see Wagner Group, for whatever neo-Nazis may admittedly be in that group, doing actual good things, actual anti-imperialist things. Not to mention that they also are still overlooking the dozen other neo-Nazi militias in Ukraine, like Corpus Battalion, ODA, or UDA, IDAR, Right Sector. There's so many of them other than Azov, but Azov became the talking point. So it just gave people the ability to overlook literal neo-Nazis that they're funding and supporting, and then also overlook the ones that are less Nazi aligned that are actually doing good things that you would support if you really wanted to take the, oh, well, sometimes we just have to support problematic people to do good things for good people, right? That's literally what is happening here. But because they've been so twisted by by American propaganda to believe that everything that's good happening against the US's interest is Russian or Chinese propaganda, that's the situation that they're in. Liberals are once again rooting for Nazis as they do in every historical conflict.
Yeah, and what I would say about that is two things. As a Southern boy, I cannot say this enough. The bear doesn't give a fuck about your superior argument. If you're in the woods and the bear is about to charge you, you cannot say, oh, Mr. Bear, I am an actualized human. I'm a good person. I give to my church, right? This is what liberal mind state doesn't understand. Force is force, and this world is maintained through force. Geopolitics is not about ideology nearly so much as application of force, which brings me to the second point. The fact that a guy like Traore can exist even, can kick Victoria Nuland the fuck out of the country, can choose to not come to Trump's inauguration, though invited, right? That in and of itself shows the decline of the empire, because such a thing was certainly not possible in the 60s. The reach and the grip on the empire was so strong. There was no way an emperor, someone that is a head of state in Africa, of all places, could be flippant to the United States of America, to kick European allies out of their country, to say, remove your military bases. I mean, you would die. You would be killed. This is the work of the alphabets. This is what they do to maintain hegemony. These are those things that they're doing that the American people can never really know about, right? That I'm talking about at the beginning of the episode, saying, yeah, all right, you did these things. But there has to be a time when all of this truth comes to light unredacted, where you can acknowledge these things in a so-called democracy, so that the people that are invoking their vote to put these people in can understand what the consequences of your choices were. Because so long as you never have to know that Obama, literally started every day going over a list of people who he would determine the ability of life and death over. This person can live. This person can live. This person has to die. This person has to die.
Turns out I'm real good at killing people.
Turns out, right? Even though there's a constitutional scholar, right? Where is the writ of habeas corpus? Where's all of these human rights that the West and the Enlightenment are supposed to be based upon? You know, everyone is worthy of a trial. All of these things that the West claims to believe in to their core, right, get disappeared in war. And when we're talking about the global war on terrorism, it's even worse because these aren't even declared wars. So this is just at the means of the president getting to dictate what is and what is not national security based upon his aims, which can be simply political, they can be financial, they can be any number of these things, right? But that kind of power is leaving, right? As these people are given other options, like, you know, when they talk about Wagner, okay, first off, you know, and you brought up Azov, we don't have to go there. We can talk about whatever faction Eric Prince is selling today, right? People act like again, we can apply all of these lenses to America. We never have to go any further than what we're doing here, right? If you don't feel like Wagner should exist, which, by the way, they're going to fuck your feelings, right? There will always be mercenary armies. So long as there are armies, so long as there are wars, so long as there are especially covert wars that we cannot declare, you have to pay people to inflict and invoke force. This is a geopolitical reality that liberals claim to be unaware of, you know? What makes the Ivory Coast rich? Fucking gold. You know what people do with gold? They fucking steal it. If you don't have powerful people with tanks and artillery to guard your mines, someone comes in and they take your fucking mine because the bear don't give a fuck about your superior argument. Hey, Mr. France, this is my autonomous country. These are my gold mines. They belong to me. Think about what I'd like to do for my people. France don't give a fuck. If you cannot secure these assets, they will be taken by military forces. It's just the reality of the world that we live in.
Mm-hmm.
So one more thing I'm going to mention. A lot of great points, gentlemen. Sorry, I wrote it down. Okay, yeah. I just want to also mention like NATO as one more thing because like it's just so useless. It's so pointless. It's just something that people spend money on. You posted something the other day, Mike, and I showed it to Tanky. I sent it to him, and it was like about the 4 NATO guys that were in the troop carrier, and they fell into a swamp, the sneaky swamp, and again, I don't want to get too far into it, but. It's just a truly embarrassing way to die, and it goes again to the point of there's so many. America has so many troops, so many places. I don't know if you remember the one of the soldiers that crossed the demilitarized zone or the border between North and South Korea. But there's always sort of some aspect of American troops that's just embarrassing. I mean, we could go into a more serious situation, things like Abu Ghraib and obviously Tanky mentioned Blackwater or whatever it's called now. Like as that, like again, just sort of another aspect of American military. I mean, it is the military industrial complex sort of expanded into Europe. But if you could just, kind of talk to sort of like the pointlessness or NATO or sort of whatever you feel about it, in terms of, America's culture or America's power or whatever.
Yeah, I've been wanting to do a deep dive on this thing called the NRO, which I just found out about pretty recently. And I think I collaborated with you guys on a post about it. But I think we should also prepare ourselves for the possibility that like the restructuring that the U.S. is doing may actually allow it to continue its existence longer than we think. Like this may not be the collapse of the deep state and American hegemony that we are hoping that it is or thinking that it is. Because the NRO is this thing that has existed for a long time. And I'm just finding out about it from posts that are ironically a year old, but it incorporates a bunch of private contractors. It's basically the entire deep state that the U.S. has always had with its 3-letter agencies, but now privatized. Now with less accountability because these are people who just work for LLCs and the books are even more dark than they were before. And that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Like that the U.S. would outsource its deep state, would privatize it, would apply the private equity slash and burn method to its government offices, and then only the strong survive. Only the people who are willing to hang with that kind of restructuring are the ones who stick around. And I feel like I've been trying to also warn Americans that that's the strategy for the entire population as well. It's like, again, one of you guys mentioned earlier, and I forgot to bring it up, but you mentioned that, I think it was you, Tanky, saying that people think that other countries want to invade the U.S. with that same imperial projection. What they really want is the U.S. out of their countries. They want you to stop meddling in their affairs. And so the collapse of the U.S. is not going to look like other soldiers in your country invading you on your street corner, asking you for your papers. It's going to look like what you imagine poverty in third world countries, but in the U.S. And it's going to look like more of the desacredization. I don't know what the word is, like the devaluing of human life, because that's what you're seeing. Like with the way they're.
That's a good one. I like that. I'm gonna write that down.
I mean, there's definitely a real word for it. I just don't know it off the top of my head. But like, they will devalue human life to the point that like you will watch your friends and family like die diseases of despair, like addictions, like preventable illnesses because they can't afford healthcare. And you're going to be left to just have to deal with that emotionally because you won't be able to actually fight any systemic level problems that are creating that situation. And that's going to be the collapse. It's not going to be like some kind of movie scenario where it's very apparent and you realize you lost the Cold War. It's just going to look like more immiseration, proletarianization, like the alienation that we all experience under capitalism, but just much, much worse. And that works really in the favor of the people who are doing the nothing ever happens thing. Like they can every day claim that nothing ever happens. This is all just normal because little by little doesn't really raise the alarm bells for people, you know?
Thank you. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing I would say is the resources are still the resources, right? Virtual assets is some bullshit. This is why I feel like, I mean, that's me. In the hood, I believe in what I could touch, right? Which is an oversimplistic way of saying what I'm saying. But like, what is the number one commodity that China is buying right now? It's fucking gold. What is the number one thing they're getting rid of? United States treasuries, okay?
Wow.
Because... right? Because gold is something you can fucking touch. And throughout all of human history, gold has had value. I don't see gold somehow losing its value and its grip on the human imagination, right? And there's only so much of that. So once you start getting away from the financialization of the American project, which is the only thing we really make now, right? Financial things. The best thing I ever saw that talked about this, and this is what you got to love about American culture, it's 5% truth. They fight it in with all of the propaganda and the bullshit. It's 5% truth. On Wall Street 2, when Gordon Gekko's talking about how, you know, there's nothing that the American government or industry really makes now, you know, and he's running off all of these bank products. And he's like, I don't know if 3% of humanity understands any of this shit, right? This is what the American project does now. You know, I remember being a child and being naive and wondering, how do banks make money if all they do is hold your money, right? It's like, you're not your money anymore. It's the bank's money, and you have to beg the bank to get it back. That's what they found out in Lebanon, you know? They reported all these people trying to steal money from the banks, and it was just literal regular workers trying to pull out their life savings. And the bank was like, no, you can't, right? All this shit is inherently insolvent. It's 100% inherently insolvent. And the only thing that makes it work right now is it's backed upon the belief in the American government's ability to endure and withstand, right? Like if that was ever brought into real question, you would see a run on the financial services, the likes of which could not be curtailed. And there are things that can bring that about easier than one might think. Like, for example, even a battle with not even a near peer adversary in like Iran. Once the petroleum markets are able to become completely volatile in a way that is not predictable, except to say that you can guarantee there'll be less. You don't know if there'll be 35% less or 50% less, but you know there'll be less. And sometimes it'll be even less than that, right? That's the only thing you would know about a war with a country like that, right? But in the American imagination, Iran, Iraq, same country. We went in Iraq and we destroyed them in under a month, right? Any third world country, which of course they see Iran as, right? Not like as a technologically a highly advanced technological ancient culture, just like China, right? Instead of seeing them that way, you see them as like a little block that can be pushed over at any time that has no ability to inflict damage on you, no ability to inflict harm upon you. When the reality is, all of this stuff is built on a house of cards, and all it takes is a little bit of stress on any card to make the entire global system collapse.
Great point. I'm gonna go ahead and stop us here, gentlemen. A fantastic broadcast. I want to give a shout out to our podcast listeners. We're available everywhere you find podcasts: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, so on and so forth. Check out our website, innercityleft.com, our Instagram at innercityleft. I will put Mike and TurnLeftist stuff all in the comments, in the description. True Crimes of the Empire. Check it out. Fantastic podcast. Lots of good stuff. Yeah. Mike, any final thoughts? Anything we missed?
Yeah, I just want to say in closing, thank you again for having me. Always fun to talk to you guys. Always good to talk to other anti-imperialists, as I always say. But yeah, please check out True Crimes of the Empire. We're on all the podcast apps, SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you can find us. I'll just say, like, in the 2 months or so that we've been doing it, we have done 2 series. We did South Africa first, and now we're on the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the thing that I've been thinking about in the time that we've been doing it, Tanky, you mentioned before we started recording something about heart surgery. And I've been thinking of that exact same metaphor for a revolution. Like, imagine if you have a society that is sick with capitalism and you desperately need open heart surgery. Now, you can turn to the anarchists. You can turn to the ones who are going to give you homeopathic remedies that will feel good, and they're not going to be very invasive, and they're not going to hurt you at all. They're not going to require any kind of like expensive equipment. And then you're going to die. But you'll feel good the whole time. You'll be very comfortable. Or you can turn to the scientists, who are going to, unfortunately, crack your ribs open. They're going to put you under heavy anesthesia. They may have to give you some kind of drugs afterwards that are like anti-rejection drugs that you may have to take for the rest of your life, but you will live a long, satisfying, and healthy life after that point, because you had someone that knew what they were doing, built on experience and science, and then built up not only a solution that solved your immediate problem, but then created a foundation for solving that problem going forward. And that's the difference between what I found is like the South Africa situation. They had a movement that was nationalist in nature, but also had some legit Marxist vanguard movement. They had people in exile who were in other countries, even though their party was outlawed by the regime government. They would come into the country and do militant operations, and they were eventually able to overturn that system and build something else that is unfortunately just about kind of like America. It's another settler colonial project in South Africa now, with a lot of inequality still that creates a lot of instability that they're dealing with. But the Democratic Republic of Congo had much more of a nationalist movement. And those nationalist divisions were fomented by the Portuguese and then later the Dutch, who colonized them. And it was to their advantage to do that. But then that created a situation where they didn't have like a principled Marxist vanguard party. And while they were able to win independence, it's been unstable. They fell into a dictatorship for 20 years after that. They had the Congo crisis and everything. And it's still not the kind of situation you would like to see. And then I can only compare that to, like, we've been talking all day about China. It's like when you have a principled revolution, it takes over a superpower like China and then builds a Marxist project, then you're able to see something that 50 years later is rivaling the greatest superpower in the world with its socialist scientific project. And that's the whole point of like what I'm doing over there, is just trying to get people to understand these historical differences and then what you actually need to be able to conquer capitalism in like a real way that holds up afterwards. So,
Tanky, final thought. What do we miss today?
Man, all you can ever do is try to make sure that you and your people are good. Like, always build your tribe. Look to your tribe. Don't reject empathy. Empathy for yourself and others is what keeps us alive, right? The whole libertarian mind state of radical individualism, that puritanical concept is inherently broken. Okay, I don't want to build roads, but I need to get from point A to point B. You know, I don't want to be responsible for putting a fire out in my house, right? We have to count on our culture, count on our civilization, love our neighbor. I don't know, they wrote about it in a couple of books that some of y'all claim to, you know what I'm saying? Like, embrace the stranger amongst you. Radical concepts. The people that want to hurt you are not the poor people. They're hurting themselves.
All great points. All great vibes. It's hard out here to be an anti-imperialist, you know, with anti-oppression methodology and push through. Being a tanky is often being right way too early. We do give a shout out to all of our general sphere leftists, as well as we all try to build coalition to somehow, you know, move forward in, you know, with this society, if that's even possible. Again, Mike, I thank you for being on. Let's do this again. Tanky, as always, we appreciate y'all. Like and subscribe for Emojilo, Tanky, Sumler, Mike from TurnLeftist. I'm Amin TMK. Peace.
Thank you, guys.
System riding to the core. Yeah. Reppin' in the city, love.